but these lawmakers have this just freakish obsession only with emissions, and they don't look at the totality of public health. If you're going to call it public health, you have to look at everything, including what it's going to do to the economy and how that's going to hurt individuals, and how actually no power, that's when people die. If you don't have power, people die.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined by my co-host Amy Cooke, coming to us from the Great White North up in Alaska this time, but we're grateful that she could make it via Zoom. For this special episode, we want to cover a topic that may be a little arcane to some of you folks, but it really is important. And that is an ongoing regulatory fight that's happening at the ECMC, the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. It's the recently rebranded agency that is tasked with permitting all things to do with oil and gas. So it's very important, obviously, in a state where oil and gas is a $48 billion industry. And the reason there's a big fight happening right now is because, well, it all kind of, like most things, oil and gas, there's sort of a pre-2019 period and a post-2019 period. And the little law known as SB 181 that sort of changed the entire regulatory paradigm of oil and gas introduced a concept known as cumulative impacts emissions. And there's been several bills that since that bill passed have sort of layered new requirements on the agency to regulate cumulative emissions impacts when oil and gas operators want permits. And that's currently coming to a head because they're expected to finalize a rule on this by the end of the year, so it takes effect next year. And there's a huge fight because the agency has walked back the draft of these rules that they originally had proposed to make it more feasible for oil and gas operators to continue to exist. And that has set off a firestorm from both environmental NGOs like the NRDC and related groups, as well as some more progressive lawmakers at the Colorado General Assembly like Kevin Priola, who we've talked about before, Faith Winter. A lot of those folks drafted a letter to the agency essentially saying, you watered it down, you're kowtowing to the oil and gas industry, even though this is a massive regulatory imposition anyway. And that's sort of where we're at, is this brewing battle that's going on over the future of the oil and gas industry and how strenuously it's going to be regulated.
Jake, I was reading the letter that the legislators wrote to the commission, and they keep talking about, or one of the accusations is that the commission is, they're prioritizing the industry over public health. But the way they view public health is through a very narrow lens of emissions only. So they're talking about emissions and ozone. What they don't do at all, what they don't look at all, is the cumulative impact to the economy of Colorado and what that does to public health. So for every increase in unemployment or the rise in the cost of energy, or when people have to go without power, the single largest, I'd say the existential threat to public health is actually no power. And Colorado is on this path literally of no power. And I think what they're going to do is get to a point where they're going to they want to shut down the oil and gas industry as a whole. And you said in the open, what is it, a $48 billion industry? It employs thousands of people. And by the way, those thousands of people, many of them live in my county, Weld County. Weld County is a financially healthy county, which makes for healthy people because they're employed in the oil and gas business, in the industry. You don't have to have a college degree necessarily. You don't have to have gone into debt gotten a liberal arts degree to go work out in the oil and gas fields. You can go to a trade school and you can have a decent salary and provide for your family and put a roof over their head and maybe occasionally go on a vacation. I mean, they look at this, they keep talking about, when I say they, I mean the environmental left and the lawmakers that are complaining about this, about the rules that actually the commission has done, like you said, done a relatively good job of promulgating. I mean, they've tried to balance and looked at what a series of laws have said on this. But these lawmakers have this just freakish obsession only with emissions, and they don't look at the totality of public health. If you're going to call it public health, you have to look at everything, including what it's going to do to the economy and how that's going to hurt individuals, and how actually no power, that's when people die. If you don't have power, people die.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And just sort of give people sort of a feel for what this is. If you've never heard of what a cumulative impact analysis is or anything like that, what they're really trying to get them to do is, so traditionally say you want to drill a well, you go and say, here, we've done some environmental impact studies on this, what this well would cause in terms of emissions or water or land. Cumulative impacts means you have to take that, measure that incrementally in comparison to all the other wells in the area that have ever been drilled or that may be drilled, and pile them together. So basically it increases the numbers to try to fudge the numbers to bias against granting a permit. That's the whole point. And it also relates to another point we've talked about. Longer term listeners of PowerGab may recall we had Dr. James Brohl on the show to talk about regulatory reform in Colorado, and one of the things that came up was oil and gas permitting, and disproportionately impacted communities was a term that came up because that's been suffused in a lot of these regulations, including this. And that's one of the things that the environmental left is really perturbed about, because what they wanted to be included and what was originally included in the draft bill and has now been stripped was language that said, if you're proposing a project within 2,000 feet of a quote unquote disproportionately impacted community, which is, if I'll link to it, but it's defined quite broadly to include, sometimes it's race, sometimes it's by income. It basically, construed at its broadest under the definition, it can impact as much as 50% of the state. So it's quite a lot of disproportionately impacted communities would be affected. And what these folks wanted was, before a permit could be granted and before operations could proceed, a oil and gas operator would have to get affirmative consent from every single person living within 2,000 feet of that operation if they're disproportionately impacted. So it's basically like NIMBYism on steroids. It's like the NIMBY final boss, if you will. You think your community input for building housing or somewhere is bad. Imagine having to get verbal consent from every individual person within almost a mile radius of a project before you can proceed, even if everything else looks good on your permitting. Now, thankfully, they stripped that out because that's quite onerous. And Ed C. Lover over at Some of the Substance did a good write-up of this. We'll include that in the show notes as well. But it quotes some of these operators saying that if that were to be the law, that would essentially just ban. I mean, that's a de facto ban, essentially, on future production. But it's just crazy, some of these demands that are being made.
But that's what they want. They want the ban because they want to end the extraction industry. Because they only look at climate change and they look at public health only through the lens of emissions, which is going to be a catastrophe for Colorado. One of the things too, they keep talking warming. So let's give them for a moment. I'll give you. So the climate changes all the time, and the planet is warmer. Now, is it as warm as it has ever been? No, clearly not, because there have been much higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. But I look at that, and actually, Bjorn Longborn had a great piece in, I want to say, National Review. He was talking about this, and he said, actually, here's when hydraulic fracturing, he talked about the shale renaissance in this piece, and we'll put it in the show notes again. When when fracking, hydraulic fracturing, and directional drilling drove down the prices of natural gas, more people had access to, let's just say, to a cheaper way to heat their homes. And he says, actually, it saved 11,000 lives per year. So the drilling, that shale renaissance, the drilling, the directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing that allowed for the abundant, affordable development of oil and gas at a much lower cost actually saved lives. And isn't that the real public health, when you save lives? And so this is where these environmental left groups that want to ban, literally they want to get rid of all fossil fuels, like the Sierra Club, like NRDC. There's a whole list of them in Colorado. And these lawmakers, they only look at it through one lens. They look at it through emissions, and they fail on economics. The economics of the ability to develop our resources responsibly, affordably, abundantly has been a boon to public health, to economic growth, which, by the way, if you want cleaner air, what you want to do is you want to have economic growth, because economic growth spurs innovation. Innovation leads to cleaner air, cleaner water, and we've seen it. I mean, literally, the United States is living proof of this.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. Obviously this stuff has trade-offs, right? Any sort of industrial activity or commercial activity has trade-offs. There are some climate impacts of oil and gas production, but you have to account for the other trade-offs, which is, to your point, this economic bounty that we've been given over the last couple of decades, because we've unlocked such a prolific industry. And not only has it helped Coloradans, it's helped Americans across the country, it's helped our allies overseas. All of this stuff was improved because we've allowed this industry to flourish. And it's, like you said, sometimes it's myopia doesn't allow you to capture those benefits. And another point of yours I wanted to touch on, because I think it's important, is their end goal is obviously to ban the industry. We know that they tried during the session. There was a bill introduced to actually completely end new permitting for oil and gas at the end of the decade. That failed, as well as some other bills. We talked about, there was a seasonal ban that they requested. That also failed. But it reared its ugly head. If people are wondering why we're talking about this stuff, it reared its ugly head in this proposed regulation. They were going to do the seasonal ban by regulatory fiat instead of the legislation that they couldn't get passed. It was stripped, fortunately, from my perspective. But it goes to show you, when people aren't paying, most people aren't watching ECMC proceedings closely unless you're directly, unless you're nerds like us, or you're directly an industry involved or a stakeholder. But it just goes to show you, these ideas keep coming back. Even when you think they're defeated at the General Assembly, they come back and they're going to keep trying.
And it's so disingenuous, right? I mean, they passed this bill as a compromise, right? It was a compromise to the Priola ban on oil and gas development, future oil and gas development. And so this was the compromise, and they hate the compromise. They still want the ban, as if we aren't going to figure out that your letter is essentially, it's tantamount to the ban that you promised you were compromising on. So it's incredibly, incredibly disingenuous. And I think that in the future, cumulative impact must include the economic cumulative impact. I don't think we're going to get it, but we should be talking about it. And that's what we should be looking at when you start talking about the cumulative impact of something. What are the cumulative impacts of these, of regulating an entire industry, $48 billion out of existence?
Yeah. And to the point, it's not as though this industry is, to this point, unregulated, and it's just been on the loose leash. There's a great little nugget in this Ed Seelover piece that talks about a person from a trade group that represents small to medium oil and gas operators, and she notes that From 2017 to 2019, which is pre, the big change in regulations, the commission approved a little under 1,200 wells. From 2021 to 2023, which is when the first round of rules were finalized from that law in 2019, only 149 wells. So a tenfold decrease in the number of well approvals. So clearly there's regulatory impacts already happening on the industry. They're less productive, less prolific than they once were. So it's not as though this is coming in some vacuum where it's just a free-for-all.
And listen, I love the people in the oil and gas industry, and I love the industry, and it's obviously been great for, I've got family that works in it, and I live in Weld County, where we're home of, I don't know, probably 26,000 oil wells. 99.9% of them have been hydraulically fractured multiple times. There are no dead children on the sidewalks, dead from breathing in emissions from an oil and from an oil well or from a well pad. It just isn't happening. But I am disappointed that we are in this position, because to some extent I don't think they realized the threat of what the environmental left. I mean, at some point, they some of them partnered with the Sierra Club on House Bill 1365 in 2010, and they never thought it would be them. And those of us who watched this said, "You're next. They are coming after you." Of course, the Sierra Club. Then it was beyond coal. Now it's beyond fossil fuels. We saw this coming. And so there is some disappointment in the oil and gas industry that they have gone along with it, knowing that they want to, the people in charge of the state of Colorado at the legislature, in the governor's mansion, the governor signed it. They're fine with regulating the industry out of existence. And I hope, it might be too late at this point, but I hope they wake up to that.
It's sort of like the online meme. I never thought the leopard would eat my face. That you
see right. Right. He always was nice to me.
Right. But these negotiations are ongoing. As of recording this, the sort of pared back rules that we talked about are still valid, but there's still fights happening. The Sea Lover piece mentions that these proceedings are going to continue at least through the end of September, if not longer. So, we'll have to see what becomes of it, whether or not the regulators cave to those demands, because they are raising a fuss right now about where the rules currently stand. But do you have any, in the meantime, do you have any takeaways for our listeners or where things currently stand?
Yeah. One is that this is predictable. This was exactly what we thought they would do back in 2010. So the first takeaway is that this was predictable. The second takeaway is the disingenuousness of those lawmakers that signed the letter, and I think there was 30 of them or something. And we'll make sure that the story links to that letter so you can see it. The disingenuousness, the bad faith negotiations that they had, and their failure on public health. So the most important thing to public health is having affordable, reliable power, and they only look at it through the myopic lens of emissions. And then, of course, because power is going to get more expensive in the state of Colorado, get your generator now while you can still afford it, and before the power goes out or before you lose your job in the oil and gas industry. Sorry to be, it's a little gloomy.
But you heard her, folks. That does it for us for another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you heard, you can head on over to iitv.org to check out our entire back catalog. We do new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get audio podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple. You can check us out there. You can also suggest future show topics or guest ideas to us. We'd love to hear from our listeners. You can send those on over at info@powergab.org. But until next week, we'll see you.